Okay, folks, as I said, we want to give you a little bit of extra structure before you go and do your Mod 7 memo on China's exchange rate regime. We want to give you a little bit more background on sort of the relationship between net exports and financing, what we call net capital flows. Now, we want to talk about this in the context of a fixed exchange rate regime, and there's some good reading there. Mankiw has a very nice treatment of a fixed exchange rate system on page 378. At the same time, I want to go into a little bit more detail, and some of that detail is going to be in 15.1 of my book. Okay. Um, Now, I have to tell you that just for the sake of realism, balance of payments accounting is complicated. It's much more complicated than in Mankiw. We want to give you really the flavor of it. So we can do it, and we're going to do it at the level of complexity of Mankiw. But I just want to warn you, if you do decide to brave my book, the stuff that's in there that's not in Mankiw won't be on the test, but it's going to be a little bit more complicated. But I think it'll give you a little bit better sense of what's going on in the real world. The other thing is, so we want to talk about this idea about the correspondence between net exports and net capital flows. Okay, so the idea is that, let's say that we have a deficit on net exports. Okay, we are importing more than we export. Okay, that means that we have what Mankiw calls, and using the traditional language, net capital inflows. Okay, now the idea is that the foreigners are willingly providing the financing for that deficit. Okay, we're going to provide an example. But if you're spending more than you are earning, or if you are importing more than you're exporting, then somebody has to be there to finance that deficit, to provide you the financing. Okay. On the other direction, if you have a surplus on net exports, let's say that you're exporting more than you import, you're going to have what we call net capital flows are negative. These are going to be net capital outflows, not net capital inflows. And the idea is that if you are earning more than you're spending, that means you have some savings that you can help finance, let's say, extra spending in other countries. So you'll be providing that extra financing to deficit countries. So there's a symmetry there. But when we start to talk about a fixed exchange rate system, we have to distinguish between financing that is not reserve based, not based in the accumulation of international reserves. That is the foreign currency holdings of the central bank. And we'll be going to be going into the topic of that foreign currency holdings, of the central bank, what we call international reserves, a little bit more deeply. But right now, all I want you to keep in mind is that since we are now expanding the financing that a country can have, we're expanding it to net capital flows, non-reserve, exclusive of reserves, and then the changes in international reserves. Okay, so the idea, I'm going to give you a little example. Let's start off with a very simple example. Here we have a country that's exporting 300, it's importing 400. Its deficit on net exports is 100. My book mentions the current account, which is an expanded concept, but we can just keep this to net exports. It turns out that means we have to have a $100 deficit, $100 deficit that has to be financed. We have to get the financing from someplace in order to sustain this deficit. In this case, the foreigners are stepping in to provide the financing, and they're financing the entirety of this deficit. And they're financing it how? Maybe through bonds, maybe through other kinds of financing, including what we call foreign direct investment. It could be that a country is purchasing more than it is selling to the rest of the world, and that corresponds to foreign firms coming in to that country and making a physical investment and taking some ownership stake. That's what we call foreign direct investment. Okay. Now let's take a look at sort of a similar example, but you'll notice here that we have the same deficit of 100, but foreign financiers, yes, they are providing part of that deficit, but not all of it. So in this case, we're assuming that foreign financiers are coming in and providing 70 out of that 100, and the rest of this, that deficit, is going to be financed how? By the central bank drawing down reserves. The central bank will be drawing down reserves. And in this case, it'll be the amount of 30. So you might want to think of this as like, well, in your household, okay, if you're spending more than you're earning in a given month or year, how are you going to finance this? It could be that you take out a loan or a credit card. This would be correspond to your credit card, but it also that you may have some savings in a savings deposit, for example, and you may be drawing down some of that savings deposit. This would correspond to your savings deposit there. Okay, so once again, we have the relative to the first example, we have the same deficit, but we only have 70 out of the 100 being financed by foreign investors, and the rest of it is being financed by the central bank. And you can see that this adds up. Net exports plus net capital inflows is equal to the change of international reserve. And I have a spreadsheet for this that illustrates this. Let's look in the other direction. Let's now think of a surplus country. A surplus country, in this case, we're exporting 600, we're importing 400, we have a surplus of 200. That means that we actually have net capital outflows. But what does that mean? That means that when we have a surplus, our country has some extra savings that it can supply to finance projects and spending in the rest of the world, and they'll be financing effectively the deficit in other countries, the deficit countries. Okay, so that's now. Okay, here once again, this is a symmetric example. So now we have the same 200 surplus, but it turns out that our domestic investors are only willingly providing 100 out of that 200, which means that the rest of that has to come from the central bank. Okay, so the idea is that we have a surplus. Okay, we have money going out of the country being invested, but only half of that, which means that the remainder of that surplus is being, in a sense, banked by the central bank. They're parking it in reserves. And you can see, once again, I think that a sort of a household example is sort of appropriate. So let's say, for example, that you are a lucky household, that you're earning more than you're spending in some period of time. You found some good investments. Let's say you buy into the stock market, but it's only half of that, so 100 out of the 200, and the rest of that remaining 100 would be reflected in an increase in your, let's say, your savings account or your checking account. I think that's a good metaphor. So in any event, what have we done here? You always want to keep in mind that net exports equal to net capital flows, the non-reserve portion. Net exports plus net capital flows is equal to the change in reserves, and we'll be linking this to the exchange rate. Next in the next video, we'll be linking up net exports, net capital flows, reserves, and the exchange rate. Thank you very much.